Good morning. Today we're starting out with the Marrow Thieves, and we're going to be talking about the dystopia, obviously, continuing sort of the tradition of dystopias that began in The Knife of Never Letting Go and continued in the Hunger Games. In fact, we could argue that the dystopia discussion began with A Long Way Gone in a real world memoir that showed us what a dystopia would look like here on planet Earth in the present time. This novel is also about dreams. It's about story. It's about family. There's a lot of things we're going to talk about. And as always, because this is a survey class, there's a lot of things we're going to miss. A couple of quick things. This is just a reminder that I'm doing this in one take. If I get interrupted by my cat, if I get interrupted by a lot of other things, I'm just going to keep going. And you may hear noises in the background, and I may be slurping some stuff to get some more caffeine into my system. Before we get going, I think that I want to talk about the idea of the willing suspension of disbelief and the idea of what it is that we're going to do when the story isn't real, and the story obviously isn't real. This story, I think, fits the magical realism genre to a T, with the exception that we have to assume that the dystopia is the real world. When I talked about magical realism with holes, we were dealing with a real world. Kids get sent to juvenile detention centers. It's hot in Texas. There are weird punishments at sorts of juvenile detention centers and adult prisons. We have a lot of situations where Holds was doing the real world, and then you had the time shifts, and then you had all of this other stuff go on. Okay. But here we begin with climate change has already happened. And now we begin with this idea that you're born with dreams and the DNA puts them in the marrow. Okay. And we're dealing with this idea that dreams somehow live in the bone, in the marrow, deep down in the bones of people. And that certainly we know is not true. And it's much, much different than a weird time shift that we were dealing with holes. So I want to talk about the willing suspension of disbelief for just a second. First of all, just to play history, I think it's important to remember that the willing suspension of disbelief began with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Um, he wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it's about this guy who shot an albatross, and then all sorts of misfortunes befell him until he could wear the albatross around his neck and walk all over the place. The saying, an albatross around your neck, comes from that poem. And if you don't have the energy for the poem and you happen to be in heavy metal, there was one of the heavy metal bands that did The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And wasn't too bad, actually. But anyway, this idea of a willing suspension of disbelief, which constitutes poetic faith. We are going to suspend our disbelief. As we walk into this novel, we are going to have a moment of poetic faith that the dreams can actually reside in the bones. Okay? It's okay to doubt, but we're going to have faith. And if I can play philosopher without a license for a second, remember that doubt is not necessarily the enemy of faith. Perhaps certainty is a bigger enemy of faith. You can ask the sisters to double check my work. The general application for the willing suspension of disbelief is that it's necessary for the audience to experience and enjoy fiction and film. Every novel we read, we know it's fiction. We know that the events didn't occur and that the persons and places may not have existed. Now, yes, I realize that there are novels like The Killer Angels, which is about Gettysburg, and all of the battle stuff is based on historical documents. There are lots of novels that pull things out of historical documents, and only the exact phrasing is fictional, but even some of the conversations are recited word for word. But for the most part, We know that the novel's fiction. We know that there was nobody named Q and nobody named Margot Roth Spiegelman, that they lived in a pseudo division that never happened. Okay? We know that Stanley doesn't exist. And because Stanley doesn't exist, there wasn't a curse. We know all of that. And if we take it to the movie, we know that the actors are playing roles. We know that the actor on the screen or on the stage is not whomever the character is. All right. And so when you take a look at those situations, we always have to have the willing suspension of disbelief in order to actually have any sort of entertainment at all. Okay. And so I think that's level one. Level two, when we get to the Marrow Thieves, we have to have a couple of things going for us. Number one, we have to accept that there's a dystopia. We've already talked about the fact that we've accepted dystopias in both the Hunger Games and the Knife of Never Letting Go, and perhaps a real world dystopia in A Long Way Gone. Climate change is a political argument worldwide, but if climate change is real, then all of the damage that was caused in the Marrow Thieves could actually happen. We have seen Indigenous people being persecuted in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. Uh, there were news reports a week or two ago about how European countries were using the COVID crisis to persecute, to discriminate against, whatever term you want to use, the gypsies, the Roma. Okay. And we know as a fact that when people can't dream, there are mental and physical problems. People who go 36 to 48 hours without sleeping and therefore without dreaming start having, the equivalent of a medical breakdown at times. Those things are all easy to accept. What might be hard for our willing suspension of disbelief is that only Indigenous people can dream, that dreams live in the marrow of one's bones, and that language can destroy the machines that harvest these dreams, and the fact that machines exist to harvest dreams. All of those might be difficult to accept for us. We have to exercise poetic faith and say that this is the world that the author built, that Dimmeline built this world, and we're going to accept it. We are going to accept it as an article of faith. I think the thing you get to criticize it for is if it sets up a set of rules and then doesn't follow through on those rules. For example, we live in the real world and we talk about the idea of gravity. If all of a sudden in the real world somebody can fly and defy the law of gravity, we're dealing with a situation where the rule apparently doesn't exist anymore. It's the same here. If all of a sudden we come across a non Indigenous person who can dream, or if all of a sudden we find out that the dreams can live, in earwax, then we start to say that the world is going to fall apart, and then we start to lose faith. But as long as the story sets up rules, establishes rules, and moves on from those rules, we can accept them and we can exercise a bit of poetic faith. This is a novel about dreams. We'll probably get to that next class period, but it's also a novel about story. And in this novel, story is two different things. There's the capitalized story, and then there's the individual story. Okay? And story seems to be concrete and ephemeral. And the quotation you see up on the slide right now kind of gives us that. Midge is going to tell a story, and as he tells this story, you can kind of see the senses waking up, people accepting the story as senses, but the word is just kind of like a puff over the fire. And in a lot of ways, this image sets up what story is to Frenchie and his little group. Okay, first of all, I think if you take a look at the two columns here on the slide, when Midge starts telling the story, it's got the words like people, it's got us, It's got we, okay? And again, I have to learn to type better. It's not a log, it's a lot, okay? Remember in your papers to double check, read from the bottom up. And then you've got boys, women, you've got plural. On the other side, small story, lowercase story, has the idea of just the individual, only the individual telling the story. One is a communal story, the second one is an individual story. There's two levels of story here. If we continue that, there's this idea of who's responsible for the story, who gets to hear the story. Capital S story, it's the job of the elder, and it's the job of everybody to remember that story. That story has to be remembered, that story has to be carried on. It's the job of the elder also to make sure that only those ready to hear the story get to hear it. And so when we have Riri and we are getting stories, small stories, just enough for her to understand. She gets the story spoon fed to her, but it's in the form of stories, lowercase. It is not the big, overarching story. Have I said story enough in this presentation, by the way? It's going to happen a few more times. Okay? Again, the collective, same quotation I had before, versus the individual. The individual's creation story is their own. They get to decide when to tell it, they get to decide how to tell it. But the big capital letter story gets set in memory by the elder. The elder and the community tell this story and try to pass it down from generation to generation. Just to sum up, capital S story, it's communal. The elders control it. It's a source of pride. It might cause some fear, but it can be spoon fed out in the form of smaller stories. And it is a story that people want to hear. Lowercase story is for the individual. Individuals get to control its release. They get to control the method of telling this story. It stems from tragedy. It may cause fear. All right? And it is desired. They all wanted to hear Wobb's coming of age story or coming to story. But once they heard it, they were sorry they did. The capital S story, they heard that they kicked a lot of ass. They also heard they got their asses kicked a lot. That didn't change the fact that they wanted to still hear the story. The individual story was a little bit different. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for. Oops, two more things. My bad. To take uppercase story and to apply it to what we're talking about in a literature class, I think this quotation and the next one that follows are an important reminder. Number one, they require an investment. Social media can't make that an investment. They can do it with the power of a beautiful sentence. We're going to talk about language use on this novel in a way that we haven't talked about the others. And we get to go in another's mind. And we talked about it in the Hunger Games. We talked about it to some degree in The Knife of Never Letting Go. And this novel, I think, hits us over the head with the idea that if we lose our humanity, either because we become a product or we start treating others as a product, okay, we're in trouble. And fiction lets us live in another's mind and allows us to hang on to our humanity. I think this is an important element of all young adult fiction that we've read so far. It reminds us the importance of being human and seeing others as human. Okay? This is the same quotation from the same article. And a couple of things. Number one, the bottom paragraph, I think, reminds us how important it is to have the willing suspension of disbelief, to imagine dangerous and alien ideas, to learn from them. Not necessarily to believe them, but to learn from them. Okay? It's not to put aside history or to put aside philosophy or to put aside science. Okay? But if fiction allows us to wrestle with our demons, as this quotation implies, it's an important element. And I think all of us have times when people get under our skin and we don't want to see them as fellow human beings, and remember that we get under people's skin as well. I'm fairly certain that this is the last slide. The next presentation is going to go talk about dreams, and we're going to pick it up from there. So I hope all of you have a good day. We'll pick this up in class on Monday, and we'll kind of just keep going from there. Have a good one.